At 07:10 on the morning of June 4, 1942, the sun was just lifting above Midway Atoll when a Grumman Avenger began its takeoff roll. Inside the cockpit sat 25-year-old Ensign Albert Ernest. Behind him, in the turret, was 17-year-old radio man Harry Fryer. Below them, manning the belly gun, 19-year-old Seaman J. Manning. They had been flying together for exactly 3 days. Ahead of them, somewhere beyond the horizon, waited the most powerful fleet Japan had ever sent to sea. 4 aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, hundreds of anti-aircraft guns already warmed and loaded. Ernest knew what the mission required. He would have to fly straight toward that fleet, low, slow, unprotected. He also knew something else. The torpedo in his bomb bay had failed again and again in combat. Most of the time, it never exploded. Sometimes, it never even ran. Yet he took off anyway, because orders had been given, because there was no alternative weapon, because the Navy expected its pilots to attack, even when the odds were not just against survival, but against success itself. Within an hour, most of the men who lifted off with Ernest would be dead. And even if they reached their targets, the weapon they carried was already betraying them. The aircraft carrying Ernest and his crew was supposed to represent a turning point. The Grumman Avenger was the newest torpedo bomber in the American arsenal, bigger than anything that had come before it, faster, heavier, powered by a 2,000 horsepower radial engine that could push it past 300 miles per hour at altitude. It carried armor plate where earlier torpedo planes had none, self-sealing fuel tanks, a powered turret with a .50 caliber machine gun. On paper, it was everything the Navy had asked for after years of painful losses. The Avenger was not obsolete. It was not underpowered. It was not outclassed. In fact, many pilots believed it was the best torpedo bomber in the world. It could fly farther than its predecessors, carry more weight, absorb more damage, and most importantly, it could deliver a single weapon designed to cripple even the largest warship afloat. A 2,000-pound Mark 13 torpedo, carried internally, released cleanly beneath the fuselage. If that weapon worked, the Avenger could survive enemy fire. It could reach the target. It could put the torpedo exactly where doctrine demanded. But once the torpedo left the aircraft, the pilot's role was over. And that was where the real danger began. Ernest's Avenger was one of 6 launched from Midway that morning. They did not have fighter escort. There were no destroyers below to draw fire, no smoke screens, no second chances. The Japanese fleet had already been alerted. As the Avengers descended, anti-aircraft fire rose to meet them. Black bursts climbing through the sky, joined seconds later by Zero fighters diving out of the sun. The attack profile was unforgiving. The pilots were forced to fly straight and level. Any sharp maneuver risked damaging the torpedo before release. Any climb or acceleration meant the weapon would shatter on impact with the water. So they held their course. One Avenger was hit and went down in flames before it could drop. Another was torn apart mid-run. A third was shot through the cockpit and cartwheeled into the sea. Those that survived long enough released their torpedoes exactly as instructed. Low altitude, steady speed, perfect alignment. And then nothing happened. No towering columns of water, no explosions along the hulls of Japanese ships, no visible damage. Of the 6 Avengers that attacked, 5 were shot down. 15 men were killed. Only Ernest made it back to Midway, his aircraft riddled with bullet holes, his rear gunner dead, his radio man wounded. His torpedo had fallen away somewhere over the ocean, the release mechanism destroyed by enemy fire. He would never know whether it would have run. Across the Pacific that morning, other torpedo squadrons met the same fate. Perfect approaches, courage beyond doubt, identical results. The failure was not isolated. It was not accidental. And it was not a surprise to the people responsible for the weapon those men had carried into battle. The torpedoes that failed at Midway were not an anomaly. For more than a year before the United States entered the war, the Navy had been testing the Mark 13 under controlled conditions. Training drops, exercise runs, recovery and inspection after impact. The results were consistent and deeply troubling. Dropped even slightly too fast, the torpedo's internal mechanisms shattered on impact with the water. Enter at the wrong angle, and it dove too deep, ran erratically, or broke apart entirely. Even when everything went right, a large percentage failed to arm. Others ran cold. Some sank the moment they hit the sea. These failures were not rumors passed between pilots. They were documented, measured, cataloged. Reports from training squadrons showed torpedoes veering off course or porpoising along the surface. Engineers recovered weapons with bent propeller shafts, jammed depth controls, and damaged gyroscopes. After early combat actions, unexploded torpedoes were pulled from the water and examined in detail. The pattern never changed. The Mark 13 had been designed in the 1920s when aircraft flew slower and lower. By 1942, torpedo bombers were faster, heavier, and far less forgiving of fragile equipment. The aircraft had evolved. The torpedo had not. Every major failure mode was already known. Every weakness had been observed. Every warning had been written down. Long before pilots began dying in large numbers, the Navy possessed clear evidence that its primary aerial torpedo was fundamentally unreliable under combat conditions, and yet nothing about how it was built or how it was issued to squadrons changed. Responsibility for the Mark 13 torpedo rested in one place: the Naval Torpedo Station at Newport, Rhode Island. Since the early 1920s, Newport had controlled nearly every aspect of American torpedo development: design, testing, production, approval. There were no competing factories, no alternative designs, no pressure from outside contractors. Newport decided what worked and what didn't. By the time the war began, the torpedo station was still operating on a peacetime rhythm: 40-hour work weeks, limited output, small production runs. In 1942, Newport produced roughly 100 Mark 13 torpedoes per month, even as the Navy was losing them and the crews carrying them at an unsustainable rate. The monopoly was protected politically. Congressional representatives from Rhode Island defended Newport's funding and authority. Proposals to open additional torpedo plants elsewhere were stalled or quietly killed in committee. Criticism of torpedo performance was classified, restricted, and buried deep inside technical reports. From the outside, nothing appeared wrong. On paper, the Mark 13 was considered serviceable. Test results were explained away. Failures were attributed to pilot error, poor technique, or combat conditions that were impossible to replicate in peacetime trials. Inside ready rooms across the Pacific, pilots reached a different conclusion. They were flying into anti-aircraft fire with a weapon they knew might not work, and a system that insisted nothing was wrong. At Newport, the paperwork remained intact. At the front, the cost was measured in empty bunks and unanswered letters. As losses mounted, the Navy searched for an explanation that did not involve the torpedo itself. The answer, they decided, was technique. Official doctrine insisted that the Mark 13 was sound if it was dropped correctly. Pilots were instructed to fly lower, slower, straighter, to hold their course longer even under fire so the torpedo's internal gyroscope could stabilize before release. Any deviation was labeled pilot error. When torpedoes failed to explode, reports were rewritten. When they ran too deep or veered away, the cause was blamed on improper approach angles. When aircraft were shot down before releasing, the conclusion was that tactics needed refinement. The weapon remained beyond reproach. Pilots knew what this meant. To comply with doctrine, they had to expose themselves longer to anti-aircraft fire. They had to fly predictable paths. They had to ignore instinct and survival in order to satisfy a set of rules written far from combat. Letters home reflected the strain. Many were censored, entire sentences cut away, but the meaning remained clear. Crews were being asked to do the impossible with equipment they did not trust. In ready rooms, the same bitter jokes circulated. Torpedoes were compared to telephone poles. Pilots spoke openly about watching perfect hits bounce, sink, or vanish without effect. But publicly, there was no acknowledgement of a problem. Admitting the torpedo was defective would have meant admitting that men had been sent to die carrying a weapon that never had a fair chance of working. So the blame stayed with the pilots, and the missions continued. By late 1942, the consequences were impossible to ignore at the front. At the Eastern Solomons, Avenger crews flew textbook torpedo runs and were cut down before they could escape. At Santa Cruz, entire squadrons were wiped out attacking Japanese carriers from perfect positions. Torpedoes struck hulls cleanly and failed to explode. Pilots began to understand the pattern. Skill no longer guaranteed survival. Precision no longer mattered. Courage was no longer enough. One squadron commander led his men through repeated attacks, knowing that, even if they reached release point, the weapon beneath them might simply disappear into the sea. After landing, those who survived wrote in diaries instead of reports. It was safer that way. Radio transmissions from dying aircraft told the same story again and again. Torpedoes hit. Then silence. No explosions, no damage observed. The loss rate among torpedo squadrons became catastrophic. Crews were rotated faster. New pilots arrived with fewer hours. They were briefed carefully, but quietly, by veterans who had already learned the truth. Fly the run, drop the torpedo, do not expect results. Morale suffered in ways no report could measure. Flying a dangerous mission was one thing. Flying a dangerous mission knowing your weapon was likely to fail was something else entirely. By early 1943, torpedo bombing had become the most lethal assignment in naval aviation, not because it was ineffective, but because it asked men to risk everything for results they might never see. And still, no official solution came from within the Navy. The breakthrough did not come from within the Navy. It came from outside the system entirely. In late 1942, the National Defense Research Committee quietly brought civilian scientists into the torpedo problem. Not at a naval base and not under Bureau of Ordnance Control, but at the California Institute of Technology. One of them was physicist Charles Lauritsen. Lauritsen had never flown a torpedo mission. He had never served at sea. But he understood something the Navy had overlooked for nearly 20 years. What happens when a heavy object strikes water at high speed? At Morris Dam, northeast of Los Angeles, his team built an improvised test range. They dropped full-scale dummy torpedoes down a long concrete chute into a clear mountain reservoir, filming every impact with high-speed cameras above and below the surface. What they saw was damning. The Navy's doctrine, low, slow, straight, produced the worst possible water entry. The torpedo oscillated as it fell, striking the surface at random angles, sometimes flat, crushing internal components, sometimes nose first, diving too deep to recover. Sometimes tail first, snapping off propellers and rudders. Even perfect drops failed more often than they succeeded. Lauritsen's footage showed that the torpedo did not need to be dropped lower. It needed to be stabilized. It needed to enter the water at a narrow, precise angle, something pilots could not reliably achieve while being shot at. Everything the Navy believed about torpedo delivery was backward. The problem was not pilot skill. It was physics. And once that became clear, the solution began to look very different from anything the Bureau of Ordnance had considered. As Lauritsen's team searched for answers, they began looking beyond American doctrine. In December 1941, Japanese torpedo bombers had devastated Pearl Harbor using aerial torpedoes in shallow water, something American planners had believed was nearly impossible. Several unexploded Japanese torpedoes had been recovered afterward, carefully examined, and largely dismissed. They looked crude. Attached to their tails were wooden box-like structures, bolted on and seemingly primitive. American engineers had written them off as unnecessary, even amateurish. The assumption was simple. Advanced nations did not rely on wooden solutions. Lauritsen did not share that assumption. He realized those wooden attachments were not mistakes. They were stabilizers. They kept the torpedo steady as it fell, forcing it to strike the water at the correct angle before breaking away. The Japanese had encountered the same problems years earlier, and instead of denying them, they had experimented. Hundreds of test drops, countless failures, gradual refinement. Lauritsen's team began building their own versions, first crude copies, then improved designs. Boxes were replaced with streamlined shapes. Wood gave way to lightweight metal. The goal was not elegance, it was control. A simple ring fitted around the tail fins, a drag device placed around the nose. They looked ridiculous. Pilots mocked them. Mechanics laughed when they first saw them. But when the modified torpedoes were dropped at Morris Dam, the cameras told a different story. They entered the water cleanly, at the correct angle. and they ran straight. For the first time, the Mark 13 behaved like a weapon instead of a liability. Turning a working solution into a battlefield weapon proved far more difficult. Lauritzon's modifications challenged everything the Bureau of Ordnance had insisted upon for years. They were unofficial, unapproved, and they came from civilians who were not supposed to be solving Navy problems. Initial reactions were hostile. Reports questioning the results circulated slowly. Requests for wider testing stalled. Newport objected on procedural grounds. There were concerns about manufacturing, about appearance, about introducing changes in the middle of a war. Meanwhile, torpedo crews kept dying. So the fixes moved quietly. Mechanics were trained informally. Instructions were passed hand to hand. Rings and stabilizers were fabricated in small batches and installed late at night in carrier hangars, far from paperwork and inspection boards. No announcements were made. No doctrine was rewritten. No one waited for permission. Pilots noticed immediately. The modified torpedoes behaved differently on release. They fell cleanly. They struck the water without skipping or diving. They ran straight instead of wandering. For the first time, crews began to trust the weapon beneath them. By mid-1943, entire air groups were using the new modifications without formal authorization. The Bureau of Ordnance still had not officially endorsed the changes, but the fleet had already made its decision. Lives mattered more than regulations, and once the torpedoes started working, there was no going back. The real test did not come in a laboratory. It came over open water, under fire. In June 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, American carrier air groups launched the largest torpedo strikes of the war. This time, the Avengers approached at higher speed, from higher altitude, with far less time spent flying straight and exposed. For veteran pilots, it felt wrong. They had spent 2 years being told to slow down, to get lower, to hold steady no matter what rose to meet them. Now they were doing the opposite, trusting a modification most of the Navy still refused to officially acknowledge. As the first torpedoes dropped, observers watched closely. They did not skip. They did not cartwheel. They did not vanish beneath the surface. They entered the water cleanly, peeled away their stabilizers, and ran true. Seconds later, columns of water and flame rose alongside Japanese hulls. For the first time since the war began, torpedo squadrons saw consistent results. Hits multiplied, ships slowed, then stopped. Escorts broke formation to rescue damaged vessels. The carefully balanced geometry of Japanese carrier defense began to collapse. Pilots who had survived earlier battles noticed the difference immediately. Attacks that once felt like suicide now felt purposeful. Losses still came, but now they came with effect. Word spread faster than any official order, carrier to carrier, squadron to squadron. The modifications were no longer optional. They were essential. The Mark 13, unchanged at its core, had finally become what it was always supposed to be. Not because the aircraft improved, not because the pilots changed, but because the truth had finally been allowed to reach the weapon itself. After the war, the story was simplified. Official histories credited improved tactics, better training, greater experience among pilots. The Mark 13 was described as having matured naturally over time, its early failures treated as the unavoidable cost of learning. There was little mention of Morris Dam, no emphasis on civilian scientists, no acknowledgement that the decisive fix had come from outside the Navy's own system. For the families of those lost in 1942 and 1943, there was no explanation at all. No letter ever said the weapon had been known to fail. No report admitted that better solutions had existed long before they were allowed into combat. Survivors noticed the change quietly. Men who had once watched perfect attacks dissolve into nothing now saw ships slow, burn, and sink. They trusted their torpedoes. They flew differently. And many lived who would not have lived before. The Avenger earned its reputation late in the war, not because it was finally understood, but because the truth was finally accepted. The aircraft had always been capable. The pilots had always been skilled. What changed was the willingness to admit a mistake. And for those who never came home, that admission came too late. Today, the Grumman Avenger is remembered as one of the most successful naval aircraft of the war. Its silhouette appears in photographs of victory. Its record is measured in enemy ships sunk and missions completed. On paper, it worked, but that success came late, and it came at a price paid by men who never lived to see the change. They flew when the weapon was broken. They attacked when failure was expected. They followed orders knowing the odds were not fair. Their story rarely appears in summaries or statistics. If this history is worth remembering, it is because it reminds us that progress is not automatic and that mistakes, when denied, carry human cost. If you have thoughts on this story or know of other overlooked moments like it, share them below. These are the details history too often leaves behind.